all focusing on your akdamot piece. And that in itself is really quite fascinating as the sort of quintessential statement, I think. The truth is I wrote this piece before I read the akdamot piece, and I wonder whether there's anything left for me to say, because much of what I'm going to say is actually completely hinted at in your response to Rabbi Brandes. The thesis that I want to put out there is that what we're witnessing has parallels. It has parallels in modern American law. It has parallels in conversion experiences in other religions. And so what I think is called for is maybe a view from 1,000 miles high of what has happened to the concept of sincerity as a kind of cultural history issue. Because my main argument is going to be that we can trace a sort of trajectory about the idea of sincerity in modern Western thought, and we see its emanations across religions and in legal thought in general, and that was really part of what your response to Rabbi Brandes was, about a change in the whole notion of how to do law and what doing halakha means. And I wanted to put that on the table as part of the story that we're telling. So there have been numerous attempts to document changing ideas of the person, the self, the increased focus on people's inner lives, often first arising in religious thought, and then their more common sense translation into new ways of formulating evidentiary rules or thinking about states of mind in law. The rough story is that there was a discernible shift away from focusing almost exclusively on a person's acts and declarations, what they said and did, toward assessing instead what they thought or felt and feeling confident that one can know what was in someone's mind. I'm usually skeptical about these grand theories, and I have to admit in the past I tried to debunk the idea of people as opaque agents with hidden motives as an entirely modern invention that gave rise to the idea of trust. But nonetheless, here I'm going to go with this grand theory. So sincerity and what it means to be sincere is actually something that modern thinkers have claimed is absolutely central to modernity. What they mean, of course, is not sincerity generally understood, because everybody has a notion of sincerity, but rather a modern idea of sincerity that has a new emphasis, right? And that is, according to Lionel Trilling, sincerity becomes a central value, and people can be indicted for failing to speak in accordance with their true intentions, with what they believe. That is a kind of new moral obligation. And that, of course, also assumes that people have at all times access to their deep and true thoughts, and their words should conform with them. So modern understandings of sincerity rest on this view of the self and of language, and its genealogy is, not surprisingly, almost always attributed to the rise of Protestantism in the West, which emphasizes interiority, authenticity, rationality, and subjectivity. So modern sincerity traffics not only in the idea of interiority, and therefore also ideals of self-reform and self-creation. And as an aside, I would say it would be very interesting to trace the parallel trajectories about notions of repentance and tshuva and giyor, because we also have new theologies of what tshuva means that seems to also be heavily inflected with new ideas about self-creation and self-fashioning. And Foucault actually made this one key aspect, the ability to know what's inside people's minds, as a special turning point. It was a major aspect, he claimed, of the new disciplinary spirit of the modern state. So for clarity's sake, I'm going to refer to the older understanding of sincerity as external or formal sincerity, right? in which, right, language is more divorced from thought, and perhaps also on an image of the self, at least of ordinary selves as distinct from elites, as lacking in depth or the ability to precisely know their interior thoughts. The identification of certain modern rabbinic approaches to גיור as Protestant is by no means my invention, right, in transforming identities. Sagi and Zohar already juxtapose what they called an earlier Catholic style of thought about conversion to Judaism with a Protestant style of thought that first arose, they claim, in the 19th century discussion of גיור. Their terminology of Catholic and Protestant roughly maps onto the distinction I just outlined of external or formal sincerity and internal subjective sincerity. And of course, they claim, as others have already, that this turn to internal notions of sincerity in halakhic approaches to גיור was at least one factor, among many others, of course, as Shai mentioned, of the now infamous polemic over the call by Rabbi Sherman for a wholesale annulment of conversions performed by Rav Druckmann's Bet Din on the grounds that the converts were, in retrospective inspection, insincere about accepting the commandments. The evidence of their insincerity was their less than scrupulous observance years after the circumcision and immersion took place. And it also has manifested itself in the increasing monitoring and surveying of converts after the conversion has taken place to ascertain whether they are indeed, right, observing mitzvot. This turn transforms conversion into an impermanent and ongoing process, not a definitive status change, right? It has no theoretical end moment, thus creating individuals who are in limbo. So the question is, do we see this elsewhere? And I was surprised to find, in beginning to research this question of sincerity, an ethnographic study, right, of 21st century Protestant conversions in Indonesia. The author was interested specifically in the question of how modern ideas about sincerity had transformed the conversion ceremony. Right? Two features in particular caught my attention: the rejection of baptism as an effective act, as well as the initiation of new procedures aimed at monitoring and surveying new converts. Now, baptism cannot make one Christian because that would be magical thinking, right? Performatives are a form of thought no longer really conducive to modern rationality, right? The absorption of modern sincerity into the conversion process also gave rise, the author claimed, to the constant monitoring of converts who were perennially on probation, right? Their status was in limbo. And monitoring is a logical outgrowth, the author claimed, of ideas of freedom and modern sincerity, because backsliding is always available, given the modern absence of communal coercion. So the new developments within halachic conceptions of גיור heighten focus on internal sincerity, annulment of conversions, despite completion of the process, including circumcision and immersion, right? After the fact monitoring, limbo status, all have their evident counterparts in other religions. So what about legal thought? That is my example from religious thought. And what about legal thought? So here too, I think what we see are some fascinating developments. Now, of course, we always have had an attention to the question of sincerity in some way as a condition for asserting political rights under the First Amendment in American law. I'm going to speak to American law, right? But we also see it in current debates about the obligation of judges to present reasons they sincerely hold, right? Which is now known as the doctrine of judicial sincerity, right? All of these provide very common, right, very startling parallels, right, to what is going on, right, also today within halakhic thought. So I have in mind, for example, the recent case of Hobby Lobby, where Justice Ginsburg dissented on the ground that sincerity is something the law simply cannot evaluate, and therefore a declaration should be sufficient. Her view was roundly rejected. Sincerity is merely a question of fact, like other credibility decisions the majority maintained. What did the petitioners really think about which courts are expert? Or think about this notion of judicial sincerity, which completely challenges older concepts of validity in law. Right? Before sincerity entered the picture in 20th century legal philosophical debates, it was surely accepted that decisions are valid and cannot be overturned merely because the judge hid his true motives for ruling as she did, provided the procedures for issuing judgments were otherwise met. A judicial sincerity obligation puts this idea of validity in doubt. Are decisions always provisional then, subject to nullification if the judge can be shown to have been insincere? This is now a very lively debate in the American legal literature, as weird as this may sound. And there have been some challenges that are coming up, right, in this incipient doctrine of judicial sincerity. And finally, and an example that I have seen from my own teaching in family law, which is the debate about legal performatives. That is, that affect status changes. For example, you are now husband and wife. Such speech acts are increasingly under attack in legal thought because they seem on the surface to be word magic. And though they certainly haven't been eliminated at all, if you're looking at new cases in family law, even though there are many other reasons for it, including technological pressures, there's an increased emphasis on questions of state of mind. Did you intend to parent, right? Did you intend to be married? And that's a fascinating development. So these assaults on formerly widely held ideas of how law works, right, all reappear in different guise in the modern halakhic debate. And this is, I think, the question that Aryeh fascinatingly raises vis-a-vis Rabbi Brandes in his Akdamot article, in which, as I read him, he takes to task Rabbi Brandes's wish for transparency in halakha, right? Wish for a kind of transparent explanation of what we are doing, don't allow any kind of wink and nods, don't allow legal fictions, et cetera, et cetera. And Aryeh says, what are you talking about? Right? Are we now getting rid of legal fictions altogether? Prusbul, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And then goes on to explain in a way that I think is really quite deep, right, how important it is to maintain both form, right, and content, right? The form of the older norm, right, and the content of the new norm. So I think that what Aryeh has put his finger on here as one of the very key things that has changed, right, is something that is not limited to the halachic worldview, and even to nor to the Israeli context. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip some of the things that I wanted to say that are actually about halachic writings, because I think this other material, we're all deeply embedded and have had lots of discussions about halachic writings. How much more time do I have?
5, 6 minutes.
Huh?
5, 6 minutes.
Yeah, I'm running out of time. So I'm going to get rid of my discourse on the halachic aspect of it, except to note, of course, that I do think the general thrust of the trajectory of halachic thinking is one that makes a, in which you see the older sources far more emphasizing external sincerity, declarations, statements, right, which also piggybacks off the notion that both off the midrashic paradigm of giyor, which is Sinai, in which Israel had deceit in its heart, but nonetheless the convert, right, since they declared Na'aseh v'nishma, right, the transformation is complete, and it also has it in the often quoted remarks that only God can know what's in the heart of man. And I think so that we see this very same trajectory including, right, the examples of the discussion of motivations, right? Was it a sincere motivation? But almost always the discussion is limited to motivations that are explicitly stated. Right? They're not necessarily hidden. And again, with acceptance, where I think I don't really need to repeat it, but the same things are happening in terms of the notion of what is acceptance. So I would just add that although I focused on American law, I don't think the Israeli legal system is exempt from this very same analysis, though I don't know all that much about it. But how about the recent Supreme Court case about conversions in private bet din? So there, right, it seems to me the court has, adopted the internal sincerity paradigm as the measure of conversion, right? And borrowing probably from the terms in which religion is discussed in American constitutional frameworks, justifies the court's decision to affirm conversions undertaken in private, recognized batei din by pointing out that the court can always monitor for sincerity. Thus, in response to concerns raised about the abuse of the law of return, Justice Noor writes, concern about abuse of the law can be dealt with by increasing oversight and supervision of a person who wishes to realize his right to status by virtue of return. Such conversions that are not sincere will not be recognized. Precisely how the court will determine sincerity retrospectively, right, is of course not spelled out. So in sum, Aryeh has shown us that new trends in גיור have focused not only on the debates about what is Jewishness, joining a community of faith or one of faith, but also on the policy considerations and ideologies that underlie the discussion. These are extremely important, but I think it is also interesting to consider larger cultural forces that seem to operate far beyond Judaism. And I also now wonder whether the generally more lenient approach of the Sephardic tradition to גיור, as opposed to the Ashkenazic one, rests not only on a very important part of the story that Aryeh tells about feelings of responsibility and what is the community you feel responsible to, but also to the Sephardi insulation from the Christian environment that gave rise to modern sincerity. Thank you.